We are in an interesting and somewhat tense political moment right now. It's likely to be less than a year till the next general election. Very soon, we'll be in the midst of a very large range of by-elections. And it's fair to say that the current government, led by Rishi Sunak, seems to be in a state of rapid decline. A lot of people would tell you it's a racing certainty now that there's going to be a change of government at the next election. So for those of us on the progressive left side of politics, this ought to be a moment, I suppose, of excitement and possibility. But a lot of us are troubled by things that are happening at the top of the Labour Party, or things authored at the top of the Labour Party. One of the most high profile of which has been brought to everyone's attention really in the last couple of weeks. My friend, and to use an old-fashioned word, comrade, Neal Lawson, finds himself under threat of expulsion from the Labour Party, a party he has been a member of for 45 years. And his sin, as far as we all understand it, specified in an email he's been sent, is that 2 years ago he quote tweeted a tweet from the Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran, which related to a deal struck between the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party for local elections in Oxford. And recognising that a deal had been done between those two parties, Neal commented on that tweet by saying, "This is proper grown-up politics." And that apparently contravenes, in the view of whoever wrote the email and has made the charge, that may contravene anyway, a breach of the Labour Party's rule book. And the context for what's happened to Neal, or what may happen to Neal, are a lot of instances of the fixing of selections of parliamentary candidates, other expulsions of Labour Party members, and a seemingly toxic culture around the Labour leadership, manifested in briefings against members of the shadow cabinet and Labour MPs and so on, none of which amounts to anything we haven't seen before. But the general consensus is that in terms of being sort of dictatorial and top-down and extremely factional in its behaviour, the Labour leadership, even relative to past examples, is probably now in a league of its own. And this tells you a lot, I would say, and I'm sure Neal would agree, about the old politics as against the new politics, and things that perhaps people turned a blind eye to in the 20th century, which have a very awkward relationship to the politics of the 21st century. So we're going to be talking about all that, really. What's happened to Neal, what it represents, the bigger political picture, and what all this tells us about where we ought to be going as against where we may end up. Neal, tell us first of all what happened, what the email said, what your interpretation is of the rule you're alleged to have breached.
Yeah, so I think, John, it's interesting because it enables us to sort of unpack a whole range of political, strategic positioning choices for Labour and wider progressive movement. But it's interesting that this is the kind of the spark that's kind of enabled us to unpack it, because there I was on a Friday afternoon, just come back from a nice lunch with a friend. I looked at my inbox and there's one from the disputes or whatever it was, committee or thing from the Labour Party, and it's kind of like a bit of a gasp moment, really. You don't expect that on a Friday afternoon, just to be told that someone's alleged something about you and it means that you've committed a prohibitive act. Someone said that you should only do those in private anyway, and it said that if I'm found guilty, then I'll be expelled from the Labour Party. And it's the allegation is, it's kind of a willful misreading of my quote tweet. As you said, I was just saying that when progressive parties work effectively together, that's a sign of grown-up politics. We have a progressive majority in this country. The progressive majority would have won every election since the year dot, since 1935, but it doesn't, because the votes are split and we let the Tories through. So over at Castle Compass, we quite like parties working together. The actual detail of what I kind of quote tweeted, I didn't know the details of what was going on in that specific ward. It turns out that the deal was done to try and push the Greens against some Labour councillors. I didn't know that at all. I wasn't commenting on the local deal. I was commenting on the incidents of cross-party cooperation, which came out of a deal in 2017, when the Greens stood aside for Layla Moran, the Liberal Democrat candidate, to beat the Conservative MP. Labour decided it didn't want any part of that, and part of this is that whole question of why wasn't Labour part of that? Why did it want to stand a candidate and run a campaign and win votes, which, the only result of which would have been a Conservative candidate would have beaten the best placed Liberal candidate? So Labour decided to have no truck with that.
Yeah.
The payback for the Greens from the Liberal Democrats was, you stood aside for Layla Moran, we'll now stand aside for you in this ward, and good luck. Now, I think that's grown up politics, that kind of collaboration. I know Labour has to make a choice locally and nationally if it wants to play a part in that collaborative, cooperative politics. I was not endorsing or saying vote against the Labour person. I was saying, look, people should cooperate. And the more we cooperate, the more we're likely to beat the Tories and the more we're likely to bring in a new politics. That's all I was on about.
Okay. I mean, as we know, away from Westminster, it's not like Labour people all over the place are averse to cooperating and collaborating, because they find themselves doing deals and establishing coalitions in local government with other progressive parties, and the Labour Party has a partnership in Wales with Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party. So it's not unknown, and yet the obvious interpretation of the email that you received is that the Labour Party at the centre is just, in principle, viscerally almost, doesn't like this stuff. And it certainly doesn't right now. Do you think there's something about the political moment that makes this question more sensitive as far as they're concerned?
Yeah, I think this is a very nervous political project, the Starmer project. I think it lacks, intellectual, cultural depth. I think, there isn't much of a kind of theoretical ideas, vision thing to it. And so in the absence of that, it becomes a pretty bureaucratic project. The Tories are failing. All you've got to do is keep your discipline, small target, fall over the line first, and everything's absolutely fine.
Also, they operate, it's part of that absence of confidence that they operate in a political frame which is set by the other side, it seems to me. I mean, that's what very often happens. And one of the lines that the Conservative Party and the right-wing press is determined to use against the Labour Party is that the idea that the Labour Party would usher in a coalition of chaos. And they're so terrified of that then deepens this aversion that they have to cooperative, collaborative, pluralist, to use a compass word, politics.
Yeah, I think that is part of it. As you said, parties, local parties, the Welsh Party, are cooperating, with other political forces, very effectively. The mass of the Labour Party membership has been converted to proportional representation, which infers a pluralist negotiated politics. The majority of the trade unions are now behind PR, and so they're accepting of that future that we negotiate, not impose. But then you've got this kind of quite brittle, hard, machine that doesn't want any of that complexity, doesn't want to match the complexity in the real political world, or even in our real lives as we go about, negotiating the things we want and forming alliances at work, in our communities, whatever else. That's the way of the 21st century. They want this old, binary, centralized duopoly to kind of slug it out. So there's as you say, there's a kind of, an aversion to anything about, cooperative politics, because they're scared of that, and because they find, I think at the moment, the culture of those who hold the keys to the party at the moment are the most tribal I think we've ever seen. Compare and contrast to, at least, some of the Corbyn stuff, would campaign with other political forces and parties. Blair was very pro talks with the Liberal Democrats. We might get into some of the history of some of Labour's cooperation with, other forces down the years. But this seems very, very determined to nip any of this stuff in the bud.
And there's a sort of factional point here as well, isn't there? It's not just about, or perhaps not just about, an aversion to cooperation and the idea that the Labour Party is one party among a small handful. It hasn't got a monopoly on the progressive side of politics. It hasn't got a monopoly on progressive ideas. There's a factional point as well, which is about the fact that although Starmer, when he ran for the leadership, ran on a sort of on a left ticket, let's be honest. I mean, the idea was it would be Corbynism without Corbyn, right? And shifted away from that pretty much as soon as he could. We all know the attitude of the Labour leadership to what remains of the movement and the people that cohered around Jeremy Corbyn, right? So Jeremy Corbyn himself will not be a Labour candidate at the next election in all likelihood. And lots of people associated with that project, broadly speaking, like Jamie Driscoll, the mayor of the North Tyne region, has been stopped from standing for the same mayoral region, which is about to be expanded and so on. Now, anyone who knows anything about Labour politics knows you're not really aligned with all that yourself, right? But neither are you on the Labour right. You're really a flag bearer for what used to be called the soft left, right? And the move on you has been interpreted as, well, they've sort of nobbled or tried to nobble the hard left, and now they're widening it out. So even the soft left is seen as being beyond the pale, maybe. And that's reflected in an atmosphere of hostility, which you can pick up between the leadership and some other big high-profile political figures, Andy Burnham, Ed Miliband, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what people's motive is, isn't it? You can't look into their hearts and decide what's fueling their kind of their beef. But I think if you
at the same time, they're somewhat less than subtle on occasion,
Yeah, but let's try and unpack where they're coming from and understand where they're coming from in a way. I mean, if you're on the kind of, because what you've got now is a kind of, it's not really been analysed, but there's a kind of late Blairism which has been allied to a kind of old hard right of the Labour Party, which is melded into something which is now running the machine.
Right, hold on, pause there, because that's an interesting point. So some of us have said, I've said this in the columns I write for the paper, for The Guardian from time to time, that this project, the Starmer project, is increasingly reminiscent of New Labour, but it's reminiscent of New Labour towards the end, circa sort of 2007 onwards, when it became very brittle and factional and sort of unsure of itself, and also devoid really of political content. If you remember by-election campaigns around that time, they were often about yobs and bogus asylum seekers and all that, and it was very hard to make out the progressive content of a lot of what they were doing. And your argument is that there are echoes of that now, before they've even taken power, in the way that the Starmer project is behaving.
Yeah, it feels very late New Labour. I mean, I cut my political teeth around early New Labour, which was pretty vibrant, pretty intellectual, very ideasy, quite plural, lots of big conversations. And through the process of government, maybe naturally or not, it got kind of more and more desiccated, more and more hollowed out, until you had those very, quite illiberal, kind of, moves around, however many thousand days they wanted to lock people up without charge.
And ID cards were in their head.
Yeah, and all of that. So it feels like, that kind of bunch, allied to the old right, which used to be formed around the kind of engineering unions, around organisations like Labour First, which are very factional organising blocks for the right of the party, people who never really liked ideas. Socialism was, what Labour governments did, and it's very, very dry, very short term, that Labourist kind of culture and ilk. And those two things have melded together. And all of those people, we have to remember, have gone through a near-death experience in two stages. The first stage was the Ed Miliband stage. Ed Miliband, who famously beat his brother, the champion of what was left of Blairism, David. And then Ed was even more guilty because he was viewed to have moved away too much from saying New Labour was 100% brilliant at everything, and then opened the party up through the voting system to the entrance of thousands of new members who in 2015 joined and elected Jeremy Corbyn. So Ed, I think, is viewed questionably by those people, and then obviously Corbyn as well. The soft left seen as the gateway drug to the hard left. There's no point in just kind of getting rid of the hard left. You have to get rid of the soft left as well, because that's where it ends up. And so it's a kind of, it feels a bit like, a campaign to eradicate anyone who isn't a true believer of that weird meld of late stage Blairism and the old hard right of the party.
I mean, it's useful or interesting as well to talk about this in terms of sort of the emotional politics and political psychology, because as much as we can talk about the often quite arcane details of Labour factional politics down the years, one thing the Labour Party has always been very attached to, I would argue, sort of irrespective of who's been in charge, really, is a very macho, bureaucratic, quite aggressive, my way or the highway kind of politics, right? And that goes right back into the 19th century and the roots of the Labour Party and the Labour movement. And it's never really shaken it off, right? Now, you know, one of the manifestations of that is that quite soon the Conservative Party is likely to be onto its fourth woman leader, right? And the Labour Party's never had one. That I would argue that's very telling, right? What has happened to you or what they're threatening you with, and lots of other people, again, is indicative of that, right? And so it's more than a factional politics. It's kind of an attitude of mind, and it's sort of rooted in a party whose heyday was in the age of the factory, when politics and political organisation was a very macho male business, wasn't it?
It was completely. It was industrial. It was mechanical, industrial. You know, linear, hierarchical. It was all the things that that our culture isn't anymore. And in a sense, that's why the soft left, in effect, has been, although it's the sort of heart and soul and the majority of the membership of the Labour Party, it always gets crushed by the machine politics of the further left and the machine politics of the right, because our attitude was always, well, let's have a conversation. Out of pluralism and diversity, you get fresh ideas, and there's always a grain of truth in your opponent's thinking, and let's hold hands and work out a better future together. And meanwhile, they're cutting your legs off.
Or along comes a tank, metaphorically.
Yeah, and it's virtually no different. That culture is as alive and kicking on the left as it is on the right of the party. They're mirror images of each other. Corbyn's leadership did not reach out to people like me. It didn't say we're going to have PR. It didn't democratize the party. It was a kind of it's a vanguard of the left or a vanguard of the right, and that's just taking us back 100 years. Into a misty past, which everyone's trying to replicate. Capture the top of the party, instill your discipline, tell people what's good for them, discipline them, to follow your line, threaten them with exclusion or nowhere else to go. And it's not pretty. It's not pretty at all.
And it's interesting that the sort of theory and suggested practice of a different sort of politics on the left is quite old now. So you and I, among many other people, are great fans of this turn that a certain section of left politics took towards the end of the 80s, just before the Berlin Wall came down presciently, which weirdly enough came out of what remained of the old British Communist Party, and people who were known as Euro-communists because they practiced a sort of softer, more cooperative kind of communism with a very, very small c, and it was barely communism at all, right? But they made all these points about the fact that traditional left politics was rooted in a world of what they call Forwardism, where the organising unit, as I said earlier, is the factory. People are perceived as being part of a homogenous mass, and the party tells them what's good for them, and they all obediently go and vote for it. And that sort of monolithic view of politics is rooted in a very monolithic society. And God knows, how long is it now? It's well over 30 years since that all came to grief, and since these very visionary people clustered around this magazine Marxism Today came up with the idea of post-Forwardism and suggested a much more plural politics in which people from the sort of orthodox traditional left had to be prepared to engage with people from other political traditions and so on, right? And yet we're still here saying, where is it? Well, I'm 53 years old. I was reading that stuff when I was 18. That's a long time ago. The Smiths were still together. I mean, that's how long ago it was. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister.
Yeah, but Morrissey fell out with Johnny Marr, didn't they? They couldn't keep the band together, could they?
Yeah.
I mean, and that tradition goes back longer, with the communists in Britain being at the forefront of the Popular Front against fascists. We have the elements of the British left have that alliance-based thing. But I mean, it comes and goes a bit in the Labour Party, as I say. You know,
Yeah,
if you look at people like Blair, was much more open to cooperation with Liberal Democrats. Politicians like Robin Cook were very pro PR. You know, before it was trendy. There's elements of it about, but there's a heart and soul and a kind of DNA to the Labour Party, which is completely anathema to a kind of dark state within Labour, which is anathema to that pluralism, that opening out. It has to dominate. It has to be the number one. It has to be in charge. It will brook no relationships or negotiation. And it's, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to do a politics, which is kind of be the change you wish to see in the world. And we want a world that's full of love, compassion, care, discussion, debate, learning, etc. And the Labour Party right now feels so far from that, machining everyone over the line in that kind of literally sort of tanky fashion. We'll come on to this, to do what, and to achieve what, and to have the agility that all of that kind of alliance building and negotiation, seeing the other side, because the person you're making me think of, or the theoretician in all of this, is obviously Gramsci.
yeah,
The one who said, how do you win proper hegemony in a society and in an economy? How do you get around the back of your opponents? How do you forge big cultural alliances? And we'll come on to that kind of political strategy stuff, because the dividing lines now for Labour about its political strategy are so stark and so dead end, and they are so building a cage out of any victory that the Tories might hand to them. And we'll talk through what the consequences of that are. But the Labour Party as a vehicle is going to have to, I think at some stage, transform itself to that modern interconnected culture, or it's gonna suffer, and the country's going to suffer. And then we'll get to the conversation about first past the post and how that is the logjam bit.
so that's the next question. That's the next question. Is how much our crooked, broken electoral system is sort of woven into this very top-down authoritarian thinking in the Labour Party. So they exist, it always seems to me, in symbiosis. And I can't quite tell you logically which one precedes the other, but there is no doubt that our electoral system feeds this very monopolistic authoritarian sort of politics. I suppose because first past the post means you don't have to reach out, right? It's so crooked. In 2005, Tony Blair got the votes of about 23% of the total electorate, and yet he still got a Commons majority. So the idea that you would have to build coalitions and have a sort of pluralist and yet majoritarian way of thinking, in other words, collaborate with other people, because then you get more than 50% of the voters, in theory, behind you, and therefore you have momentum, and so on. Unnecessary. You can have monopoly power with the support of a quarter of the electorate. So why bother reaching out? And I suppose that's the nature of that relationship between the electoral system and this sort of old-fashioned politics we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think it's even more systematic than that. First past the post is absolutely key to the continuation of this old kind of machine politics, because what it enables those who control the machine to do is to discipline people inside the party first. You've got nowhere else to go. The electoral system means, given it takes whatever it is, 35,000 votes per Labour MP, but 850,000 per Green MP, you can't go and start a new party. We've seen that with the SDP, with Change UK, blah, blah, blah. You can't make a breakthrough, because first past the post stops the breakthrough of a new political entry. So you can't, you either stay in the Labour Party and suck it up, or you go into the irrelevant land of other. And I'm not saying there that voting Green isn't, for those who want to do that. And I'm obviously being very careful with my words here, John, because we know what happens if you say advocating vote for anyone other than Labour. You either go with your heart and principle, or you make, in the majority of cases, an effective vote around the least worst option. So they've got us trapped inside the party, and they've got the voters trapped because they've got nowhere to go either. And if you are a kind of quite nervous, insecure political project, and the one thing that pumps you up every 4 years is the voting system, where people have to hold their nose and vote for you regardless, even though you're just a kind of, the least worst option, why are you ever ever going to want to get rid of that power of guaranteed second place and guaranteed, no alternative ever entering the race and competing with you. So despite the fact that the vast majority of Labour Party members want PR and the trade unions, that hardcore at the centre, under all of that pressure, is not going to put a promise for PR in the manifesto, because it's completely and utterly, not in their interest. I was in a conversation this afternoon. People said, when are the leadership going to wake up? They are fully awake. They're as woke as can be when it comes to electoral systems, and the electoral system of their absolute choice is first past the post, because it has that disciplining power.
Yeah. Despite the fact, just to make this clear, that the Labour Party conference has voted to embrace proportional representation. So the Labour Party, is a sort of collective entity, for what it's worth, seems to believe, or does believe, in a large part of what you've just outlined. It's just that the leadership is dead against it for all the reasons that you've said. And it's interesting as well to sort of reflect on what the people at the top of the Labour Party are actually clinging to, what that means. And it's a political system and a political model, which essentially means large stretches of uncontested, almost omnipotent conservative rule, right? Until the Conservative Party gets exhausted and hits the buffers, and then the Labour Party gets a go, mostly on the basis of less than 50% of the electorate. I think the Labour Party's only had the votes of more than 50% of the electorate once in 1951, and weirdly, because of our electoral system, it lasted in power for another year, and then the Tories took over again, right? So there's no continuity. Mostly you get the Tories. Every now and again you get the Labour Party. And I mean, is that really such a brilliant thing to cling on to? Surely to God there is a better way of doing it, and that's what this represents. And yet they cling.
Yeah, I would suggest there is a better way, and it's not just that you only get these sporadic. Since 1918, the Tories have been in power 70% of the time. But even when Labour gets in, under first past the post, because you're appealing to that kind of centre ground, those few swing voters in a few swing seats, because the hold, when you're working on that narrow band of the electorate, maybe 150,000 people, 200,000 people, those swing voters in swing seats, the power of party donors, rich party donors, the power of the big corporate media, and in particular Murdoch and the Mail, are so strong that you have to lean in their direction to get their blessing in order to get over the line first, under first past the post. And by doing that, you've kind of lost before you've started, because you've had to accept their political agenda. And the sight of Keir Starmer, happily going to the Rupert Murdoch summer party and drinking his champagne. Now I'm not, we understand that politics has to be professional. Yeah. You have to play a lot of those games. We're not saying ignore those people, because they are powerful. But if you bet the ranch on appeasing those people, you've built a cage out of your victory. And then you then dissatisfy the electorate who want something different, and then you very quickly enter into a kind of a spiral. And so we're suggesting that, go and see Murdoch, go and see the Mail, go and see all the, of course you have to do that as professional, grown up, use that term again, politics. But there is a progressive majority in this country that has been there since 19. Why not appeal to that progressive majority as a starting block? And then you don't build a cage out of your victory. You build a platform that you can begin to build on, because it's built on progressive terrain and progressive ideas and progressive people. And you can then start the virtuous cycle of going in the right direction, rather than spiraling the wrong way from the word go.
I mean, that's a really interesting point, that the symbolism of Starmer, and obviously he's not the first to turn up at that Murdoch summer party, shows that the Labour leadership will reach out to people from other political traditions, right? But they're always, from our perspective, the worst ones. What a strange politics is that you gladly go and hang around with Rupert Murdoch and the Daily Mail because you think that's necessary, and yet Caroline Lucas must be spurned, right? And the social liberal, the sort of more left-leaning bits, the Liberal Democrats, must be spurned. And yet Rupert Murdoch is just part of what it takes to achieve power. That's an odd, again, we're very sort of inured to these things. They're normalised, right? But it's weird. That's weird.
Yeah, and what you're signalling by going to Murdoch's summer party is that nothing really is going to change. Okay, we'll do a few bits at the margins, and in a minute, maybe let's compare and contrast where New Labour was in '97 compared to now. But that's all you're signalling. That don't worry, there's no threat here from an incoming Labour government. Don't put your media guns, on the field against us. We're fine. You can live with us, And you mentioned Caroline Lucas. I mean, again, I have to be careful about what I say, but isn't Parliament a better place with people like Caroline Lucas in it? And she's stepping down at the next election, But to have a variety of voices, more Liberal Democrat voices, more Green voices, new voices, in all the complexity of the things that we face, to have a parliament with no Green representation, and Labour will do its best, and I understand the electoral realities of the people in Brighton Pavilion, they want that seat as well. But our politics will suffer enormously if we eradicate all of that difference, all of that complexity, all of those different views. The world is so hard to understand now. The idea that one tiny faction who currently runs the Labour Party, that isn't the Labour Party, but runs a bit of it and is in control now, can surf the complex waves of the 21st century with all of the challenges coming towards us, is just a non-starter. We need that kind of pluralism and diversity.
There's something we haven't said, which I'll say as briefly as I can, and I want to ask you about the history of Compass and the practice, right? Not just the theory of cooperating with people from other political traditions. The point is, as much as anything, that this monopolistic, you're either with me or you're against you type of politics has no relationship with wider society and how people actually think about politics, right? So I spend half my life going out talking to people about politics. In the course of my journalistic work, and it's very, very rare that you meet people who say, I'm a Labour person, I'm a Labour to my core, I'm 100% Labour, or I'm 100% Tory, or I'm 100% Liberal, or whatever. Now, there were quite a few people like that, I'm from a Labour Party family, and I think my certainly my grandparents' generation, this might be true of my parents' generation to some extent, thought of themselves like that, right? And people don't now. If you look at statistics for how much people switch between parties from one election to the other, it tells you a great deal. I can remember a reporting job I went on 10 or 15 years ago. I think I went to NUS, the Student Union Conference. And there was someone I met there who was in their 20s who said they were a member of the Green Party and the Labour Party. And I said, well, you're not allowed to do that, And they had no idea. That seemed as reasonable to them as being a member of the RSPB and a member of the National Trust and a member of the Ramblers Association, right? Because that sort of denotes who you are. And yet, if your politics is a bit red and a bit green, as far as the Labour Party is concerned, you are forbidden to express that. And that's what the 21st century is characterised by, right? And that's another reason why all of this feels spectacularly incongruous. I think if we spend half our life talking to sort of political insiders. I think if we went sort of out there, so to speak, and I said to someone, this is my friend Neil, he's just been thrown out of the Labour Party for doing this, I think people would think that was very strange.
Yeah, I only watch BBC. I'm having nothing to do with that newfangled ITV or let alone Channel 4. I'm just going to stick with
Netflix. God forbid.
I was born BBC, so I'll always be.
Yeah.
I know. I was Blue Peter, and you were Magpie. I'm sure that's the case. Is it, John?
Well, Tiz was Swap Shops a bit, yeah. Or Tiz was the one I used to watch when my mum wasn't looking. So that's that's where we find ourselves. But it's a chronically old-fashioned way of looking at everything.
And it is, but it's also massively hypocritical because there they are saying to me, you can't infer that working with other people, is something that's acceptable. And then they're out there in the by-elections going to the Green voters and the Liberal Democrat voters, vote tactically for us. Now, give us your tactical votes. And for them, it only works one way, as if that's the way the world works. You've got to vote for us. You have to get the Tory out, give us your vote. We won't say thank you when you've done it. And when it's, the other way round, we won't support you. Or they do it behind closed doors. We know that, at least up until now, that Starmer and Davey had a kind of, secret by-election pact Don't tell anyone. But everyone knew because they didn't used to visit the ones that they weren't prioritising. So there was definitely a deal. So they can do it in
They do it
secret.
on the quiet. Yeah.
Yeah, but the electorate or the activists, they can't do it. They mustn't do it. But vote tactically. But don't tell anyone. And it's just smoke and mirrors. It's hypocrisy, and it needs to be blown out of the water. And the only way of blowing it out of the water really is proportional representation, where everyone gets to vote, how they want, and they know that their vote counts, and that people then therefore have to work together. Labour might still win majorities. It might not. It might. But that's a reflection of the politics of the real world. And as you said, trying to base everything on tiny minorities and kind of little vanguards that can control, pull the levers in Whitehall is just kind of, it's 100 years old, this politics, and it's running into the ground. And what scares me is what happens if Labour do win, either as a majority or a Labour-led government, and they continue this kind of controlling politics, which by definition will not work. And let's just compare and contrast where this project is a year out from potential election and government compared to the run up to 1997. When, as I said, I cut my political teeth. In 97, there was a really talented bunch of leaders with a really interesting political program, culled from really big thinkers, like Julian Legrand and Anthony Giddens and Charlie Ledbetter and Will Hutton. It was a vibrant debate about ideas, the third way. It had an interesting program, and it was doing all of that in the most benign economic circumstances.
Yeah.
50 consecutive quarters of growth, no distributional problems, sell into government, top skim from the city, spend on Sure Start, spend on education in the NHS. God, it was so easy, right? I mean, but they did it with some style and some verve. Now, there are some nice people and good people, but in terms of the intellectual project, they can't even begin to match it. There's kind of no real sense of program. They're U-turning on their own, ideas, and they're going to meet the most malign economic and social circumstances.
Okay.
And in that mix with this controlling culture, you've got a recipe for real struggle and real problem.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, the bit that really should motivate all of us. That if that fails, then the regrouping of the hard right, of the authoritarian populist right, of this new conservatism, that's going to come sweeping back in. So their stakes now are so high, given climate change, given cost of living, given we're watching the kind of rebirth of populists across Europe at the moment, and the routing of social democrats, because it's such an old political culture, that this is we're really in the eye of the storm this time.
But there's a profound and sort of awful irony at the heart of that, isn't there? Which is that this project that wants people to think of it as being strong and ruthless and tough, right, by dint of behaving like that, renders itself fragile because of how risky politically the surrounding circumstances are, right? Yeah, brittle doesn't quite do it justice. The point is it's fragile, right? It's very interesting to me that the words, the things that Starmer wants to convey to people for some reason are in keeping with exactly that sort of mode of behaviour that's led to them attempting to, or beginning the process potentially of throwing you out, right? Which is this idea that he's ruthless. That's a word you hear a lot around Starmer, right? Over the weekend, there was a sort of leaked thing, but these things don't get out by accident, when he was saying, I hate tree huggers, meaning I don't like green activists, So again, it's quite a sort of macho message. I'm not standing for this, I'll lock them all up and all that stuff. And the point is, because that imprisons the Labour Party as this small entity, it means it's less capable of dealing with this awful crisis in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, and let's kind of be clear about what we think. It's not as if we're expecting a Labour or a Labour-led government to come in and usher in nirvana. That isn't the case. We're not going to recreate 1945 or heaven on earth in a single term, right? That isn't the game. The game is to elect a government with the capacity to grow and develop and become stronger over time. To realise that politics isn't just about inhabiting the state, although that's important, and then transforming the state. I mean, there was a quote from one of the Labour shadow cabinet figures. We don't want to fix the House of Lords or do democracy now. We've got to fix the country first. And I think there's more and more people everywhere who recognise you're not going to fix cost of living and you're not going to fix climate or the NHS or whatever else until you fix our democratic system. And the centrepiece of that is PR, and it goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier, that on what terms can you win a government? Can you win them on progressive basis? And what we want is a government that says, okay, first, base camp, win an election on terms which are kind of favourable to progressive politics, broadly favourable, and then we start colonizing different elements, that we boost the trade unions, we boost civil society, we build an alternative media, we start doing all the things that make progressive politics more powerful over time. We take the B Corp movement and supercharge that. We take cooperatives and bring them in the 21st century. We kind of look at public services and say, how do we see public service workers as co-producers of that service? How do we democratize public services, the NHS? How do we start building citizens and not just consumers? Step by step, gradual, building the confidence and the ability of people to change their world collectively, individually, locally, and nationally. Not a revolution, nothing kind of fixed from the top, but recognizing that the job of political leaders in the 21st century is to help everybody else do the right thing in the right way and head in the right direction. Now, that isn't too difficult. I don't believe that is impossible. It's not even impossible now, as we enter this crucial phase. If the Labour Party could realise that, this isn't about them and their heroic efforts to pull the levers and to deliver whatever, they're not going to deliver, following Wes Streeting's brilliant, no hope is better than false hope. Well, is that the option, Wes? No hope or false hope? Can we do a bit better than that? Can we have realistic hope? And the Labour Party is, and you and I have been discussing this, the absence of a vision, a hope, a kind of sense of direction. This is just the weirdest moment, isn't it? As the skies crash in and the cost of living and mortgages go everywhere and a frightening future in tech, and what are we going to do after Brexit? I mean, my word, we need something a bit hopeful. I mean, not, pie in the sky, but the kind of things we just ran through, which are kind of pragmatic kind of politics for a better progressive future. Is that impossible? Is that beyond hope? Is that false hope? I don't think it is. I think it's absolute kind of rock solid, room 101, pragmatic, progressive politics.
Just sort of by way of conclusion, let's just go back into the mists of history as far as you and Compass, the left pressure group that you're the chair of and that you co-founded. Because it's a long time ago now, sort of 14 or 15 years ago, Compass was mostly associated with the Labour Party. And if you went to a Compass event, it was mostly Labour Party people there. And there were sort of, it would be big-ish figures from the Labour Party on the platform and all that. And then quite quickly, things changed. And Compass began to sort of open up to other voices and really be there as a means of bringing people from different progressive parties together, right? And this is part of what's landed you in trouble. This is the sort of origin story, right? And I think it's interesting to talk about why Compass took that turn in two ways, really. I mean, there's the question of why politically that's a good thing and what that might enable the left of politics to do that it can't do at the minute. But then there's also the business of that being an experience which sort of in itself is a good thing, right? That it's good to meet people from other political movements and traditions and so on, right? Let's just talk a bit about that, because I think it's very hard to understand or make sense of what might or might not happen to you and the state of politics in general, unless you make reference to those things, right?
Yeah, and we were chatting the other day. I mean, talk people through the Caroline Lucas moment.
So I can't remember quite when this was. I think it was in about 2009. It was the sort of arse end, so to speak, of New Labour in power. And there was a Compass event at the Institute of Education near Euston Station in London. And it was mostly sort of broadly Labour sort of aligned people were there, because they're the people who tended, I include myself in that, certainly I'm not being sniffy. They were the sort of people who tended to turn up to Compass events and want to sort of engage and have a good day of it and all that. And there was a session in the afternoon where she made a sort of podium speech, like a keynote speech. And I felt that it was pretty obvious there was an atmosphere of tension when she started speaking. There was a bit of standoffishness on the part of the people there, a bit of, oh, you're not from the Labour Party, oh, we're not quite sure about you. And what she did really was outline why there was more to her and the Green Party than this rather banal idea that they're just about the environment and the climate crisis, as important as those things are, right? And she talked about her profound belief in social justice and why society had to be more equal and democratic and all that. And by the end, these people who'd begun by thinking, well, oh, I'm not sure about the fact that she's here, were won over, really. And I think that, in retrospect, that was a kind of watershed moment, as was a big event Compass staged immediately after, like 2 days after the Brexit referendum in 2016, where Caroline Lucas was on the platform, so was Vince Cable, a guy from the SNP, whose name I always forget, Tommy is his face. Tommy Shepherd. Amina Gachinga, who was part of this very interesting small sort of political grouping or burgeoning movement in London called Take Back the City. It wasn't just a Labour Party platform. And what was interesting was by then, that was totally the natural order of things and nobody queried it at all. And everything that each of those people said about Brexit was really well received and there was a great discussion. So, you know, the Caroline Lucas thing was the start of it. And that moment was, to me, when it was confirmed that people totally got it. That all these people necessarily, Clive Lewis was on that platform as well, that all of those people necessarily had to be in the same room and be talking to each other. And that was the way ahead, and it told you something about the future. So that's that from a perspective of someone who's come to Compass events and spoken at a few. I think they're my two sort of staging posts, really.
Yeah, and it goes. I mean, you know, we were just a Labour Party organisation. You effectively had to be a member of, for the first 10 years of Compass, you had to effectively be a member of the Labour Party to be a member of Compass. And then we found in our kind of more, you know, as we grew more distant from New Labour, obviously there were kind of people that we strongly disagreed with in the Labour Party. I mean, you know, very strongly, who kind of were much more neoliberal than we were comfortable with. And there were people outside, you know, the Labour Party, like Caroline Lucas, you know, who we kind of agreed with on everything. But, you know, the more neoliberal people could join Compass, but Caroline Lucas couldn't. And that seemed just a daft thing to us. You know, Compass is about a good society. It's not about the Labour Party. It's about how do you get to a good society, one which is much more equal, democratic and sustainable. And so we changed our rules in 2011 to say it doesn't matter what party you're a member of or not, any, you know, no party, you know, come and join us if you want that stuff. And I thought that was quite just a sort of straightforward, natural, let's make this kind of, you know, not tent as big as possible, but let's have this campsite where we all share, we all play games together. We might go back to our Labour Party tent and you might go back to your Liberal Democrat one or whatever else. But actually we're much better when we come together and there is a kind of common good and we share so many values and, so, you know, and we can learn from each other. It's that learning from each other. As soon as we got Green started joining and then Liberal Democrats joining and others, we just saw the world so much more richly. You know, you could anticipate stuff. You were in touch with stuff. You could meld different traditions together. It's so much better to operate in that way rather in that kind of machine, binary, everyone's my enemy. I hate everyone. I've got nothing to learn from anyone. You know, I don't like anyone. I mean, you know, that isn't seductive and that isn't kind of creative and that isn't imaginative. So it's a much nicer way of doing things. And you get, as you were inferring, you get better outcomes, you know, because you see the world, you know, as in all of its complexity from your vantage point, because you've got all of these different views. But the joy of finding out. So that's why our local groups are brilliant, because local activists find out, go, oh, I'm in the Labour Party, but actually, you know, these people in the Greens, I mean, we're all cut from the same progressive cloth. We have slightly different views. I'd be more kind of workerist and pro-trade union than maybe some Liberal Democrats, but they'll be much better on civil liberties. And the Greens will be obviously much better on environmental issues. And out of all of that, you can concoct something which could deal with the perma-crisis world, you know, that we're facing. So we've tried to use Compass over the years to sort of prefigure, you know, and kind of test out, you know, how do you meld things together in a way that can meet, you know, all of those challenges. We're 20 years old this year. We haven't changed anywhere near as much as we should have done or could have done, but we keep trying to, you know, develop it as a potential vehicle to you know, to meet, you know, the opportunities and challenges of the 21st century.
So the arguments for this sort of slightly clunky word pluralism politically are sort of three or fourfold. It's quite a complicated argument. One is that if you're going to tackle the climate crisis and the fact that what some people, me included, called neoliberalism has sort of reached its end point, you know, and inequality is clearly out of control. This is a very, very troubled world. If you're going to deal with all of that, then you need the support and involvement of as many people as you can, right? That's a sort of instrumentalist argument for pluralism. But then another argument for pluralism, it seems to me, is a very simple one, which is that it's quite clear that organised politics, what some people call high politics, Westminster politics, is very estranged from real life in a way that it probably wasn't at the height of the Labour-Tory duopoly in the 20th century, because the Labour Party was rooted in a great chunk of wider society via a very, very vibrant, large trade union movement. And the Conservative Party, it's easily forgotten, was very good, They hadn't read Gramsci, but they sort of knew what they were doing, Gramsci-wise, The Conservative Party, I think, had 2 or 3 million members, and the Young Conservatives, they said, was a sort of dating agency as much as it was a political organisation and all that. So they were out there as kind of mass organisation. Now we feel all of us feel very estranged, or most of us feel very estranged from mainstream politics. And the reason, I think, is precisely because of this monopolistic, top-down, my party, right or wrong type mindset, because it finds no echo in the world. The world isn't like that. I mean, partly because of social media and what that's done to people's consciousness. Every minute of every day, if you use social media, as much as a lot of it's toxic, you get out your phone and you're confronted with people from all sorts of different political traditions, right? Whether you like it or not, it's at its best, it's a sort of pluralistic experience. And so the arguments that the likes of you and I are making for reinventing politics are really to bring it into harmony with what everybody else takes as a given, what 21st century society actually is. Because as I said earlier, it's not a world in which people have either got the red t-shirt or the blue t-shirt and there's nothing in between. That's nonsense.
Yeah, and it is all looking, the old stuff is looking very far back in the rearview mirror, isn't it? And okay, it's got its bad echo chamber stuff, and the right can use social media, as well as the left or progressives. But as you're alluding to, and I'm not going to say anything more than you've just said, it's liberating. We find autonomy, we find voice, we find organising power at the touch of a few buttons and a few hashtags. You can meet, your people and organise yourself and do stuff and make things happen, protest, demonstrations, enterprises. This is how, in that interconnected creative world, that's the world we live in. Compare and contrast that with that kind of, go and sit in the drafty hall, someone reads out the minutes, report back from the council. If you're lucky enough to have an MP from your party, they'll tell you what they've done in Westminster. You clap and you go home. I mean, this is just so far beyond, and away from and behind what we do. And I go back to the fear. I mean, the choice. There is a choice now. The choice will be that the authoritarian right will just sweep in and go, we tried the progressive stuff, we tried the democratic stuff. Look, it's not working. Because it's so old and out of date. It's either that, or we are going to kind of, dramatically deepen our democratic capacity and capabilities, starting with proportional representation, just as the starting point of allowing people every day of their lives, wherever they want to have collective expression and to have greater control, to exert more, to have more security and more freedom over their lives. They are the, it isn't quite, maybe it will get to socialism or barbarism, but that socialism has to be deeply, deeply, profoundly democratic, participatory, engaging, respectful, tolerant, all of that stuff. And we are fast coming to the point where we're not going to be able to avoid that choice. At the moment, the British Labour Party is machining its way to a kind of, 1-0 win where the crowd have left early, and Jose Mourinho, and this is, I shouldn't go into a football metaphor, but was always said, you win by not making a mistake. Don't have the ball, let the other side have the ball. Now, we want total football. We want beautiful politics. We want tricks. We want everything, and we want the crowd not to be the crowd. We want the crowd on the pitch. They've got to participate in it all. And the metaphor's now stretched to beyond.
Back in that old English form of football where the whole village joins in, right? Kicking a pig's bladder 5 miles.
And everyone gets to go, and everyone plays, and everyone has the joy of that collective, building experience. And that's what the future has to be, or it will be a bloody awful one. and it is, we are getting to the crossroads of that choice.
Okay.
And I think we need to get people prepared for that in order to do the things we need to do to make the right choices.
Last question. What do you think is going to happen to you? But then also, what do you think is going to happen to politics more widely looking ahead? I mean, you've sort of alluded to that, but as you've said, it does feel as if the awkwardness of the fit between politics done like this and the sort of wider moment, will have to sort of give rise to something. We can't carry on like this. We've had a succession of revolts of one kind or another against politics as usual in its sort of monopolistic, top-down, old-fashioned two-party form, right? 2014, Scotland got a lot closer to independence than some people thought was going to happen. 2 years later, there was the Brexit referendum, which is really a sort of mass revolt in various ways against the traditional way of doing politics and the political class, right? And then just before that, the Labour Party voted for Jeremy Corbyn as leader in revolt, really, against this very controlled, sort of spin-based way of doing politics. So it's not like the writing isn't on the wall in all sorts of ways. I just wonder what you sense, really, of where politics might go in the next 3, 4, 5 years, and begin with what's your sort of instinctive sense of what's going to happen to you.
Well, obviously, I think what happens to me is irrelevant in all of that stuff. I mean, I might get a technical, win, or they might, take me down into the bunker of HQ and put a bullet into the back of my head, and that whatever will be. We're trying to use this as an opportunity to make the case for pluralism, for cooperative politics, for listening to other people, and it's almost ridiculous that you have to fight and shout for that. But we'll continue to fight and shout for it because it's really important to establish that principle and for people to see people in and around the Labour Party making the case for cross-party politics, for PR, for that pluralism or whatever. And we'll see how that works out. Okay. In terms of the bigger picture, look, anyone who obviously makes predictions anymore is a fool. So here's my prediction. Look, the point about stuff is we never know what's going to happen until it happens. No one, as you were saying, John, no one quite knew how close the referendum in Scotland was going to be, what was going to happen over Brexit, or that Boris was going to win so big in 2019. I always kind of think about what the good citizens of Berlin were thinking on the 8th of November, 1989, the day before the wall fell. Did they think the Stasi were going to go on forever? Did they think that, those control mechanisms were going to be in place and their lives were going to be continually blighted and narrowed, and they were going to be disciplined into stuff they didn't want to do and live in a country which was being bossed by people with no imagination and no wit and no verve and no vision? And then the next day, it all starts to crumble. This is the way these things always work. They get eroded culturally, intellectually, and organisationally, and they keep going until they just they are stretched beyond kind of ridicule, beyond appropriateness, and that will happen at some stage to our politics. The new politics will wash in much faster than we ever thought, because it's already there. It's there in the councils that cooperate. It's there in the communities that work together. It's there in the B Corp movement that are kind of putting, the planet and people beyond profit. It's there everywhere. The last bastion is in this kind of tight coterie at the top of this monopoly, duopoly, that want to keep control. And when it goes, the floodgates will go quickly, and we have to make sure that the flood that comes through is progressive democratic politics, because otherwise it will be authoritarian right-wing politics. So it's the pursuit of that beautiful politics, that this is all about.
The point is to remain hopeful while understanding that the stakes are very, very high. That's it, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Let's finish on Gramsci. Live without illusions, without being disillusioned. And I think that's absolutely right. Let's be realistic, but let's be kind of realistically hopeful about what we have to create, what we're up against, and how high the stakes are.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, John.